welcome our last panelists up. I just want to congratulate the audience. Many of your colleagues have fallen off over the course of the day, but you've stuck it out. You have earned a networking reception after 30 more minutes of an INCOMPAS Policy Summit. And lucky for you, here you are for the main event. I'm bringing big Section 230 panel energy, or at least I'm trying to. Does the FCC have the courage to give us the IP or the TDM to IP transition that we need for the next generation voice services we so richly deserve?
No.
No, but in all seriousness, I am so proud to have an excellent group of legal and policy minds up here to talk about some of these really important issues. I'll just go from left to right. We've got Hank Kelly, a partner at Kelly Dry. Thank you so much for being here. Josh Ruby, the General Counsel of Granite Telecommunications. Greg Rogers, the Head of Global Policy and Regulatory Affairs at Bandwidth. And Michael Pryor, not only a shareholder for Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber, and Schreck, but also General Counsel or outside counsel to the Cloud Communications Alliance, one of our partners. I think it's a timely issue. There's a lot going on here, but to a certain extent, I am actually more energized, I think, about this issue than I have been for the last 18 months. We've seen Chairman Carr talk about this very issue in the last couple of days. But there are also some outside activities that are happening that require us now, I think, to address this issue in full. We've seen a series of petitions from providers that still operate, believe it or not, TDM and legacy infrastructure that are seeking to discontinue or grandfather their services. Every week, Taylor Absher, our new policy advisor, in our weekly update, lists the incredible number of copper retirement notices that are going out. And so this is a timely topic and something that needs to be addressed in order for us to ensure competition in voice services, but then also to help the FCC meet some of its goals. So, Greg, why don't you kick us off? Bandwidth has been very, very involved in some of these most recent petitions. Tell us a little bit about this issue. Why are you concerned about the impact on competition, and what you're doing to ensure interoperability between the TDM and IP aspects of your network?
The last question first, which is scrambling every single day to try to fix disruptions. Like literally, that's what's happening. And I would say that, we've heard so much of what we're talking about here today is what's ahead, where are we in the tech transition revolution, whatever you want to call it. And you've heard people talk about move fast and break things a lot, right? That's sort of this internet mantra. Where you don't want to do that is in 911, right? But that is what's happening, right? That is what's happening. Copper retirement is happening really fast. They're moving fast and they're breaking things. And so that's what we're trying to get the word out about and try to get people to really come to an industry gathering point, if you will, to figure out how to conduct an orderly transition. Bandwidth has always been an all IP-based provider. We've always been an advocate for IP interconnection, IP traffic exchange, voice over IP feature functionality, the richness that you can get in next-gen 911 environments. But there's a transition to occur. You don't just flash cut from the PSTN of today to an all IP, future tomorrow. And we're witnessing that just doesn't happen. It's a very intricate set of complex interconnection players, and doing it in an orderly fashion is really what we're out right now trying to sort of advocate for.
Josh, same question for Granite. How are you sort of managing, I think, this transition? And then are there other use cases that you're concerned about?
So I think from Granite's perspective, right, we serve exclusively business customers. And so the thing that's interesting about business customers who are still on TDM is that there are all these use cases that are dial tone based use cases, right? Where you've got an old piece of technology that relies on a dial tone to send wherever its data is, wherever it's going. And it's tough to figure out what to do with that. So the one of these use cases in particular is fire alarms. The fire community has really decided to go back to the future on this, right? If you read the NFPA 72 regulations on this, they're very focused on, I want to make sure that this dial tone is exactly the same as the PSTN dial tone, right? It's provided by a licensed carrier. It is a loop start as defined by those old Telcordia standards that it's kind of hard to even get a copy of. It's got to have voltage, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, one of the things that's difficult is in terms of supporting customers to deliver what amounts to the exact same thing that the PSTN already delivers, because that's what they are going to need to continue supporting their dial tone based applications, you know, fire alarms, burglar alarms, any, you know, other type of modem, out of band management, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a second piece to that, which is if you're delivering a solution that supports dial tone in that way, there's a question about what the backhaul connectivity is. A lot of them that are out there in the marketplace are wireless only, pride themselves on being able to be deployed wireless only. And if you look at the AT&T residential application for discontinuance in Oklahoma in a very limited number of wire centers, that application says that their alternative, the AT&T Advanced phone, can, and the default method of connectivity is wireless only. There's a follow-on application that AT&T filed in Oklahoma for business customers. It doesn't say that. It says the default method of connectivity should be wireline broadband. How that's going to get squared with retirement of the wireline facilities is unclear. I don't think anybody's asked that question. That application is still pending, that 214 application for the business lines in Oklahoma by AT&T. But I think that what that really is driving at is that these business applications are unique, they're sensitive, and it's tough to see what's going to happen if those are deployed wireless only, right? It introduces latency, jitter, all sorts of things, and those are questions that just have not yet been answered to, I think, the fullest at this point. So.
Hank, same questions coming from your clients. I mean, sort of, you know, what are some of the issues associated with the retirement transition that are sort of affecting your clients?
The same thing that Greg and Josh's client have experienced. It's just the complete lack of transparency into when the ILECs are going to be discontinuing copper and when they'll make available the IP interconnection that's supposed to substitute for the copper that they're getting rid of. There's no transparency to what they're doing. And so as Greg kind of described, you know, there's a notice that goes out that there's discontinuation, and in the carriers, the CLECs and other carriers, the providers, it's just playing a whack-a-mole game. You have to go around and try to fix solutions or find solutions along the way. But the real problem is just, I think, not coordinating among the carriers. There's no transparency by the ILECs when they're discontinuing. And like, these are all interconnected networks. And so everybody knows that when you have an interconnected network, there needs to be collaboration among the providers to make sure that there's no loss of services, 911 services in particular. But that's just not happening. And that's the big issue. And it's not just, you know, there are certainly lots of end users that can be adversely affected by discontinuation of copper, but there are providers out there also that host VoIP traffic, that host other providers that interconnect with wireless providers that need a lot of those DS1, DS3 services for backhaul and for other uses. And so there's just needs to be a better effort by the industry, hopefully led by the FCC, to create standards for retirement of copper, standards for the transition of technologies in the networks. You know, there's there's lots of standards out there. It happens all the time. NEA has the standards for interconnecting to ESI nets. The California Commissioner of the Office of Emergency Services, they created standards when they built out their ESI net in the transition from copper to IP networks in California. And so standards can be created. There happen. It just needs to be cooperation and some leadership at the FCC. You know, the states are doing some of that leadership. I just mentioned California. So there's some leadership in creating standards and how you migrate from a TDM to an IP network in a large scale. But there just needs to be more leadership.
So the states have the courage to give us the transition, or at the very least, they're so tired of the FCC not giving it to us that they're moving ahead. Michael, so much of your practice, revolves around, counseling your clients on what's been going on with robocall mitigation and call authentication. So many of these solutions that have been developed, are IP based and therefore require IP interconnection in order to work. So how is the lack of IP interconnection really impacting a provider's ability to give us effective robocall mitigation, call authentication, some of the solutions that have become commonplace over the last few years?
Isn't that nice to be talking about voice service and plain old interconnection? And after all this talk about AI and Section 230, nice, comfortable area to be talking about.
Sexy.
Sex, wake up. It's sex.
That's why it's the main event.
Yeah. So the continuing presence of TDM in the networks, and I can't believe that we're still talking about TDM in the networks, is undermining the ability of the FCC to combat robocalls. The key maybe, I'll just say maybe the FCC kind of put all of its chips or a bunch of its chips in robocall mitigation in this technology called stir shaken, which I'm going to assume everybody is familiar with. Stir shaken is essentially a way for the originating carrier to tell the terminating carrier, this is a good number and the caller is authorized to use it. It's designed to combat spoofing. But it only works in IP networks. And so if there's any TDM in any of the hops between the originating and terminating carrier, all of that good information that stir shaking asks the carriers, or requires the carriers to put in there, gets lost. It's gone. So this creates a real problem. And as TNS recently put in some really interesting statistics on this, if you assume that stir shaken and the ability to know whether a call is spoofed or not has some utility in mitigating bad calls, then you want to have the ability of that stir shaken information to go from the beginning to the end. For the big 7 voice service providers, about 86% of the time, that stir shaken information gets from the beginning to the end. Whether it's within Verizon's network or in AT&T's network or between AT&T and Verizon, whatever. For the rest of the industry, that number is 19%. This means that a lot of companies, a lot of telcos have been spending a lot of money to implement stir shaken and are not seeing any benefits from it. So one of the real important reasons to accelerate IP interconnection is to enable this continuum from the beginning to the end of this important stir shaken information. And the FCC has, it just sort of has been sitting back and waiting for the industry to figure this out. And I think, without IP, you're not going to have stir shaken be effective. And you're also going to not have the ability to really utilize some of the other upcoming robocall mitigation ideas like branded calling, where you can, a caller can have its name and phone number show up on your phone when he calls. So it's really important to fix this IP interconnection issue, if for no other reason than to restore the trust in the network, which is what we really need.
So let's give the FCC a vehicle. Hank, thanks for mentioning so many of those standards, that the FCC needs to look at with respect to this issue. But what procedural steps can the commission take to, to sort of get us there to achieve this next gen transition? And another question, and probably the most important question, in the absence of Chevron deference at this point, does the commission possess the requisite authority, statutory authority, to meet the challenge of this issue to give us the next gen transition? We'll just go right down the panel. Well, Hank, go ahead.
I'll start. I'm sure it's probably best if it's done at an industry level rather than try to adopt a regulation but there's got to be some leadership there. I would tell my clients that whether the FCC has the authority, in light of Loper decision, whether the FCC has the ability and the regulations to force upon the industry certain standards for the transition, I would hope so. But given the issue, whether it's a material question enough to give them the authority to do that, I don't know. I really don't know. I think that the FCC or the Supreme Court's decision, with a material question, really makes it difficult to predict with a lot of certainty which of those decisions the FCC's got the regulatory authority to adopt or not.
But Josh, as we prepared for this, you mentioned a lot of the areas where the commission already does sort of exert authority over IP-based voice services.
Yeah, so I think one thing, just to take a note from the famous Section 230 panel, is that Section 214 begins with a 2. And so under the same, at least arguable theory that was debated then, that the commission has, plenary rulemaking authority over discontinuance over Section 230, it would arguably have the same authority over a Section 214 proceeding. And even without that regulatory authority, I mean, if you're watching these proceedings go by, all that has to happen is that there's a suggestion by the staff that in order for this particular petition to go through, some particular condition must be met, right? The FCC can, in theory, use that in successive proceedings to develop ad hoc a set of conditions that are that would have to be met for successive petitions to be allowed, right? So I don't think, Hank, that gives you the clarity that you're looking for, because each new petition would be its own new adventure, and there would always be the option for the FCC to add new conditions. But in terms of allowing development case by case, that's one way to do it that is legally defensible.
Just real quick, I think it was INCOMPAS actually that also advocated for that in the Verizon Frontier merger as a condition to impose that like IP interconnection and and better notice about the discontinuation of copper as part of a condition to the merger.
I went into overtime in my holiday PTO to make sure that got in. So absolutely. Yeah. Greg.
Thank you for that, Chris. I think one thing that I'll highlight from Bandwidth's perspective that we think is a relevant and important source of authority for the FCC is we're a CLEC, right? And so when Michael talks about IP interconnection and when we talk about IP interconnection, we may not be talking about exactly the same thing. For us, what we're really focused on now is what it means to be a CLEC anymore, and whether 251 and 252 still require ILECs to engage in local exchange interconnection. And that's where we're seeing the breakage, is that we're delivering IP network capabilities to co-locations in local exchanges, and we want to then interconnect in IP. It's not being offered. They won't do it. And so that's where we're really trying to shine the light on what it is to be a CLEC, to carry voice traffic using telephone numbers at the local level. So even in a VoIP numbering petition, the VoIP provider, in order to get their authority, generally and pretty much always has to demonstrate that they have a CLEC partner who is capable of delivering traffic at the local exchange level. That's still true. And so you can't just turn on IP interconnection and not fix those kinds of rules. It's not going to, it won't work. So we want to move fast, to Michael's earlier comments, but we don't want to move fast in ways at the local exchange that cause disruption and breakage. And again, as a 911 provider, that's where we're really trying to emphasize that breakage at the selective router has very serious implications that people should be paying attention to, and not sort of in a willy-nilly way declaring like today is the day that copper retirement happens. So, you know, those are a bunch of the sort of intricacies that we're trying to bring to the fore about what it still means to carry voice traffic with telephone numbers that need CLEC networks foundationally.
Michael, what do you think?
Yeah, well, if the question kind of is, does the FCC have authority to mandate IP interconnection like it has authority under 251 to mandate telco to telco interconnection? You know, one way that the commission has imposed obligations on VoIP providers is through ancillary jurisdiction. You know, so it has done that time and again for universal service, for CP&I, and so forth. The other thing that I think about, and going back to my pet peeve about stir shaken and getting this traffic across, is something called the Trace Act, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. In that act, which sort of directed the FCC to mandate stir shaken, kind of said, look, we realize there are non-IP networks out there. So you, FCC, you know, kind of work with the industry to figure out how are you going to do call authentication on non-IP networks. And so far, the FCC really hasn't done much there. I mean, there are ATIS standards for workarounds, but there's a lot of controversy in the industry about workarounds because they worry that it might reduce incentives to move to IP. But I suspect the Trace Act, you know, might also be a source of authority to say, hey, if you've got a TDM tandem, you're interfering, you're on a non-IP network, you're not doing enough to ensure the flow of stir shaken information go to IP.
So we've got issues with NG 911. We've got issues with robocall mitigation. We've got issues with rich call data. But the commission has, in one of those areas, recently sort of dictated or required IP interconnection, and that's in NG 911. It said that IP interconnection is required in order to ensure that that emergency calls, reach 911 call centers. Does that provide any kind of model for what the commission can do on this issue moving forward? Greg, can I start with you? I know this is a big issue for bandwidth.
It is, and the last time, so I'm in Denver, get to DC periodically. Last time I was here was for the NENA conference, and NENA and its membership is out looking for funding to advance the deployment of next-gen 911 networks from Congress. To some of Hank's earlier comments, it's happening in a very patchwork manner. It is not uniform. And certainly the FCC's most recent requirements about how the industry is supposed to adjust and adopt ESINet deployments is going to exacerbate that, right? That even at the PSAP level, a PSAP can declare itself to be an ESINet. And now everyone in the industry is required to go and connect in IP at that 6 months after they declare that they're ready to do it. You have some instances like California that are doing it in regions with 4 separate ESINets. You have statewide ESINets. In each instance, you have a vendor that comes in and wins the contract to be the ESINet, and then sets out to get everyone to interconnect into it in IP. But you have to migrate all the PSAPs off of their selective routers to get over to the ESINet too. there are over 5,000 PSAPs in the country. And so just envisioning the project of migrating all of those people, the entire industry, right, at the local level, because PSAPs are fundamentally local, in an orderly fashion where there isn't breakage to your emergency calling, is really what we're talking about. Like, that's what this represents to us.
Michael, I've got one more for you at the very end, for Hank and for Josh. You know, you all have companies with customers. Granite has customers. Is the FCC doing enough to inform you and the customers of your services that these things are being discontinued? If not, what can be done to improve that process?
Sorry, the answer is no. They're not doing enough. Sorry, Josh. And I think that they just have to impose on the other carriers obligations to inform people and to sort of collaborate better with the deployment of IP networks and to give notice to the consumers. And I don't know how they do that, but they should do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think from our perspective, that comes mostly from the carriers themselves, right? The FCC has little to do with it, and I mean, not little, but principally that ends up being business affair between, for example, Granite and our underlying carriers, right? And so even if there's perhaps not as much of the regulatory requirement as we might like, as a business matter, you know, we're dealing with the entities that are trying to effectuate these retirement proceedings, and so they are our business partners, and they, as a business matter, you know, are good at letting us know that these things are happening. But I agree with everything Hank said as a matter of as a legal matter.
Well,
I might just, if I can, because I think that highlights an important point, which is that if it can be done, you know, in an organized, collaborative way, which I think it should be, it's a win-win, right? I don't think that the LECs are looking for a lot of disruption, right? And they may not anticipate it, but everyone ought to be in this together, really, at some fundamental level.
Well, INCOMPAS is going to keep working with CCA and a number of other industry organizations. We've started talking about this, and we want to continue to bring this up to the commission. And this is going to continue to be a really important part of the work that INCOMPAS does in 2025. We did have a bit of a win, Michael, and I want you to have an opportunity to talk a little bit about that with respect to there's been a lot of call blocking that's been used and to avert or mitigate illegal robocalls. And one of the problems, I think, for competitive providers has been that when calls are blocked using analytics, you know, sometimes it's not, you don't quite know why. But the commission addressed this recently. Can you sort of walk the audience through what happened and how that's a win for the competitive industry?
Sure. And being mindful that I'm maybe the only thing standing between you and the bar, I will make this as short as possible. But if you are a service provider serving business customers, this is important for you because your business customers are trying to reach their consumers and their calls are often blocked. The Trace Act and the FCC requires those entities who are doing blocking to have redress options for you, including any point of contact to say, hey, you're blocking my good calls, stop it. Problem is you don't know to do that unless you've been notified about the blocking. It has been a long fight about how that notification looks in the SIP signaling. And the FCC finally resolved that issue by saying everybody in a year has to use what's called SIP code 603 plus. So what that means is if your customer's call is getting blocked by analytics at the terminating end, that terminating provider is going to send that code 603 plus back to you. And in that, it's going to say, hey, I'm blocking your call. Here's who I am. Here's how to contact me. So be ready to implement that because that'll be very, very important for your customers.
And that was about 5 to 6 years worth of fighting that we did on that one. So that was a big deal. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you. It's a tough spot being the very last, and you guys were great.